They were told Americans would burn them alive, that white soldiers would treat Japanese women worse than animals. But when 847 Japanese women stepped off a dusty train in Arizona, August 1945, the enemy didn't greet them with rifles and chains. Instead, a sunburned cowboy in boots and a wide-brimmed hat grinned and said, "Barbecue rib Sunday, ladies. Hope y'all like 'em smoky." They expected torture. They got slow-cooked meat dripping with sauce. They braced for death. What they received would shake everything they believed about America, about war, and about themselves. If you're interested in untold stories from World War II, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because what happened next changed these women's lives forever. The war was over. Japan had surrendered just days ago, and across the Pacific, millions tried to understand what came next. But for a group of Japanese women gathered in a holding facility in the Philippines, the future looked terrifyingly unclear. They were nurses, radio operators, clerical workers, and translators. Some had served in military hospitals on Pacific Islands. Others had worked in administrative offices, filing papers and sending messages. A few had been teachers caught in war zones. None of them had fired a gun or dropped a bomb, yet here they were, prisoners of a war their nation had lost. The oldest was 52, a head nurse who had tended wounded soldiers on Saipan. The youngest was barely 19, a radio operator from Okinawa whose hands still shook when she heard airplane engines. They wore a mixture of clothes, some still in their stained nursing uniforms, others in simple civilian dresses, torn and faded from months of chaos. Their hair was cut short to prevent lice. Their faces were gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath tired eyes. On a sweltering August morning, American soldiers told them to gather their belongings. "You're being transferred," an officer said through a translator. The women exchanged frightened glances. Transferred where? For what purpose? In their minds, the possibilities were all terrible. They had heard the propaganda throughout the war. Americans were monsters who showed no mercy, especially to women. They were loaded onto trucks, then onto a transport ship. The journey across the Pacific took 2 weeks. Below deck, in cramped quarters that smelled of salt water and diesel fuel, the women huddled together and whispered their fears. "They will kill us when we reach America," said Keiko, a 28-year-old nurse from Nagasaki. She clutched a small photograph of her parents, the only possession she had left. "My brother told me before he died. He said the Americans hate us. They will make us suffer." Others nodded in agreement. They had been taught this for years. American soldiers were described as devils, beasts without honor or mercy. Japanese propaganda had shown them images of cruel, savage Americans who delighted in violence. Now, as prisoners, they were sailing straight into the enemy's homeland. What hope did they have? Yumi, a 24-year-old translator, sat in the corner keeping a small diary written in careful Japanese characters. She wrote, "August 17th, 1945. We are going to America. I do not think I will survive. If anyone finds this, please tell my mother in Tokyo that I thought of her at the end." The ship rocked and groaned. Some women became seasick, vomiting into buckets. Others stared blankly at the metal walls, their minds elsewhere. They thought of their families back in Japan, families who might be starving, living in bombed-out ruins. They thought of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They thought of the surrender announcement, the emperor's voice on the radio speaking words they never imagined hearing. Defeat. When the ship finally pulled into a California port, the women were ordered on deck. The sunlight hit them like a hammer after weeks below. They squinted, raising their hands to shield their eyes. Before them stretched a harbor filled with American naval vessels, and beyond that, a city that looked impossibly clean and undamaged. Buildings stood tall and whole. Cars moved along paved streets. People walked freely, carrying shopping bags and newspapers. It was a world untouched by bombs. A world that looked nothing like the devastated Japan they had left behind. The women stood frozen at the ship's rail, staring in disbelief. Where were the ruins? Where was the destruction they had been told about? Japanese propaganda had assured them that America was suffering, that Japanese forces had brought the enemy to its knees. But this city looked prosperous, peaceful, frighteningly intact. "It's a lie," someone whispered. "This can't be real." But it was real. The evidence spread before them like an undeniable truth. Japan had not been winning. Japan had been losing badly. And now they were about to set foot in the nation that had defeated theirs. American soldiers guided them down the gangway. The women moved like shadows, their wooden sandals clicking softly against the metal ramp. On the dock, military policemen watched them with expressions that were hard to read. Not cruel, but not friendly either. Professional, detached. One young MP who couldn't have been older than 22 stared at them with what looked like curiosity. He had probably never seen Japanese women before except in propaganda posters. The women, in turn, had never seen American men up close except through gun sights or in photos used to inspire hatred. They were loaded onto buses with barred windows. The engines rumbled to life and they began moving through American streets. The women pressed their faces to the windows, watching everything pass by. Grocery stores with full shelves visible through glass, children riding bicycles, women in colorful dresses pushing baby carriages, men in suits reading newspapers at outdoor cafes. It was overwhelming, incomprehensible. This was supposed to be the enemy, but it looked more like paradise. The buses drove for hours, leaving the coast behind and heading inland. Through the windows, the women watched America transform. Cities gave way to farmland. Farmland gave way to desert. By the time they reached Arizona, the landscape had become something alien, flat, dusty, dotted with strange cactus plants they had never seen before. Finally, the buses turned off the main road and approached a gate. A sign read, Camp Florence, U.S. Army Facility. Guard towers rose at intervals around a perimeter fence. Rows of barracks stretched across the desert floor. The women's hearts sank. This was it. This was the camp where they would face whatever punishment America had planned for them. The buses stopped. Guards opened the doors. "Let's go, ladies. Welcome to Arizona." The heat hit them immediately. Arizona in August was like standing inside an oven. The air shimmered above the ground. The sun felt close enough to touch. The women, most of whom had spent their lives in the more moderate climate of Japan, had never experienced heat like this. They were led into a building marked processing. Inside it was marginally cooler, with fans blowing warm air around. American nurses in crisp white uniforms waited behind tables. The women were told through translators to form lines. This was the moment they had dreaded. Processing. What would it involve? Humiliation? Torture? Their mouths went dry with fear. Instead, what happened next shocked them into silence. The American nurses smiled, not cruel smirks, but genuine, tired smiles of people doing their jobs. "Welcome," one said through a Japanese-American translator. "We're going to check your health, get you cleaned up, and give you fresh clothes. Just cooperate, and this will go quickly." One by one, the women were examined. The nurses checked their eyes, looked in their mouths, listened to their heartbeats. They were gentle, professional, thorough. When they found signs of malnutrition or disease, they made notes and marked the women for medical treatment. Then came the showers. The women were directed to a large tiled room with multiple shower heads. They were told to remove their clothes and bathe. Keiko, the nurse, felt her eyes fill with tears. This was it. This was where the humiliation would begin, where they would be stripped of dignity in front of their captors. But the American nurses simply handed them towels and bars of soap. Real soap. White, clean, smelling faintly of lavender. Not the harsh lye soap they had used in the military, but actual good soap. "You have 15 minutes, the translator said. "Use hot water if you want. There's plenty." Hot water. The women stared at each other in disbelief. They approached the showers hesitantly, as if expecting the water to burn them or the soap to be poisoned. But when Keiko turned the handle and water sprayed out, it was clean and warm and wonderful. She hadn't had a proper hot shower in over a year. None of them had. They had washed in cold. Rivers and buckets of dirty water and ocean spray. But this was luxury they had forgotten existed. The women began to cry as they washed, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sensation of being clean. The soap lathered in their hands. The hot water rinsed away months of dirt and fear and exhaustion. They scrubbed their skin until it was pink. They washed their short hair until it squeaked. When they emerged, wrapped in towels, they were given fresh clothes. Not prison uniforms, but simple, clean dresses and undergarments. Cotton that smelled of detergent. Soft fabric that didn't scratch or chafe. Yumi, the translator, touched the dress she had been given as if it might disappear. She wrote in her diary later, "They gave us soap. Real soap. They gave us hot water and clean clothes. I do not understand. Where is the cruelty we were promised? Where is the hatred?" The women stood in their new clothes, their clean skin still tingling from the hot water, and looked at each other with confusion and something else. Something they were afraid to name but felt nonetheless. Relief. Gratitude. Hope. But they told themselves not to trust it. This kindness must be a trick. The suffering would come later. It had to. The propaganda couldn't have been completely wrong. Could it? After processing, the women were led to the mess hall. The building was simple, just a long wooden structure with a metal roof, but inside it was organized and clean. Rows of tables stretched across the floor. American soldiers sat at some of them, eating their own meals. They looked up when the Japanese women entered, curious but not hostile. A few nodded. One even smiled slightly before returning to his food. The women were directed to a line. At the front, behind a long counter, American cooks in white aprons waited with serving spoons. Large metal trays held food, real food, steaming and fragrant. Keiko was near the front of the line. As she approached the counter, she saw what was being served, and her mind struggled to process it. There were mashed potatoes, white and fluffy, with butter melting on top. There were green beans, seasoned with bits of bacon. There was fresh bread, soft and still warm. And there in a large tray were thick slices of meatloaf, brown and glistening. The cook, a middle-aged man with a friendly face, spooned generous portions onto her tray. "There you go, miss. Eat up. You look like you could use it." She didn't understand his words, but she understood the gesture. He was giving her food. Lots of it. More than she had seen on a single plate in years. The same thing happened to each woman in line. Their trays were filled, actually filled, with food. By the time they sat down at the tables, they were holding more nutrition than they had eaten in an entire week during the final months of the war. They stared at their trays in shock. The smell alone was overwhelming. The meatloaf smelled rich and savory. The bread smelled like comfort. The vegetables smelled fresh, not rotten or wilted. No one ate at first. They just looked at the food, then at each other, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. Was this a test? Were they supposed to refuse? Would they be punished if they ate? Finally, an older woman, the head nurse who had worked on Saipan, picked up her fork. "If they wanted us dead, they would have killed us already," she said quietly. "We might as well eat." She took a bite of the meatloaf. Her eyes widened. Then she took another bite and another. The other women watched her for a moment, then slowly, hesitantly began to eat as well. The food was good, better than good. It was delicious. The meatloaf was tender and seasoned perfectly. The mashed potatoes were creamy and rich. The bread was soft and sweet. Each bite tasted like something from a dream. For women who had been eating rice gruel and pickled vegetables for months, and sometimes nothing but watery soup, this meal was almost unbelievable. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others ate quickly as if afraid the food would be taken away. A few wept silently as they chewed, tears running down their cheeks while they spooned potatoes into their mouths. Yumi ate mechanically, her mind racing. She kept thinking about her family back in Utusai, Tokyo. Were they eating tonight? Did they have anything to eat? Her mother, her younger sister, what were they surviving on in the ruins of their bombed city? And here she was, a prisoner in enemy territory, eating butter and meatloaf. The guilt was almost unbearable. Around the mess hall, American soldiers continued their own meals, occasionally glancing at the Japanese women. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked uncomfortable, as if they weren't sure how to feel about eating in the same room as the enemy. But none of them were cruel. None of them mocked or threatened. They just ate their food and minded their own business. When the meal was over and the women's trays were empty, the cooks called them back to the counter. For a moment, panic flared. Were they in trouble? Had they done something wrong? But the cooks were just offering seconds. "Anyone still hungry? We got plenty more." A few women, emboldened by desperation and hunger, accepted. They received another serving of everything, just as generous as the first. They ate until their stomachs were full for the first time in longer than they could remember. That night, lying in their barracks, the women whispered to each other in the darkness. The barracks were simple but clean, with real beds and actual mattresses. Each woman had been given a blanket and a pillow. The windows had screens to keep out insects. Fans circulated the air. It was more comfortable than many places they had slept during the war. More comfortable than the shelters they had huddled in during bombing raids. More comfortable than the transport ship that brought them here. "I don't understand," Keiko whispered to Yumi in the bunk next to hers. "Where's the punishment? Where's the cruelty?" Yumi had no answer. She stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of a full stomach, the softness of a real pillow beneath her head, the clean smell of freshly laundered sheets. "Maybe it comes tomorrow," she finally whispered back. "Maybe they are fattening us up first, like cattle before slaughter." But even as she said it, she didn't quite believe it. Something else was happening here. Something that didn't fit with anything they had been taught. The next morning began with a bell at 6 a.m. The women woke groggily, some still exhausted from the journey, others having barely slept due to anxiety and confusion. They dressed in the clothes they had been given and filed outside for morning roll call. The Arizona sun was already climbing, and the heat was building. The women stood in formation while American officers checked names on clipboards. It was all very orderly, very military, but not particularly harsh. The officers didn't yell or threaten, they simply counted, checked, and moved on. After roll call, breakfast. Once again, the women filed into the mess hall and received trays of food, this time scrambled eggs, toast, oatmeal, and coffee. Real coffee, hot and strong. Some women had never tasted coffee before. The bitter, rich flavor was startling but not unpleasant. Then came the surprise that would define their entire time at Camp Florence. After breakfast, they were assembled outside the mess hall. An American officer stood before them with a translator at his side. "Ladies," the officer said, his voice carrying across the dusty yard, "I'm Captain Morrison. I'm in charge of this facility. I want to make something clear to you right from the start." He paused while the translator converted his words to Japanese. "You are prisoners of war, and you will be treated according to the rules of the Geneva Convention. That means you will be housed, fed, and cared for properly. You will be expected to do light work, laundry, cleaning, some kitchen duty, but nothing beyond your capabilities. You will not be harmed. You will not be abused. You will be treated with basic human dignity." The women listened, barely daring to believe what they were hearing. The translator continued as Captain Morrison spoke. "I know what you've probably been told about Americans. I know you're scared, but I want you to understand something. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. You are not our enemy anymore. You're just people far from home, and we're going to make sure you're safe until you can go back to your families." He paused again, then added something that made several of the guards smile. "One more thing. This Sunday we're having a camp barbecue. That means ribs, cooked slow over mesquite wood. It's a tradition here in the Southwest. You're invited. I hope you'll come and try some real American cooking." The translator finished, and the women stood in stunned silence. A barbecue? They were being invited to a barbecue? By their captors? It made no sense. After the assembly, the women were shown to their barracks more thoroughly. Each building housed about 40 women in bunk beds arranged in rows. There were bathrooms with actual toilets and sinks with running water. There was a common area with tables and chairs where they could sit and talk. The windows could be opened for fresh air, though during the day the air outside was too hot to be refreshing. Some women were assigned to work in the camp, laundry. Others were assigned to the kitchens to help with food preparation. A few were assigned to clean the barracks and common areas. The work was not difficult, nothing like the hard labor they had feared. And they were paid. Not much, just a small amount in camp scrip, but it was something. With that scrip, they could buy items at the camp store. Toothpaste, soap, writing paper, even small candies. Keiko stood in the camp store that first afternoon, staring at a display of Hershey bars. Chocolate. When was the last time she had tasted chocolate? Before the war, maybe when she was a child. She couldn't remember. The price was listed, 5 cents in camp scrip. She had earned 15 cents that morning for 2 hours of work in the kitchen. She could afford 3 chocolate bars. The realization made her dizzy. She was a prisoner, and yet she could buy chocolate. She purchased 1 bar, held it in her hands like something precious, and walked outside into the blazing Arizona heat. She sat in the shade of a barrack and slowly, carefully unwrapped the chocolate. The sweet, creamy smell made her mouth water. She took a small bite, and the flavor exploded across her tongue. Rich, smooth, impossibly delicious. She thought of her parents, her siblings, everyone back in Japan. She thought of the cities in ruins, the people starving, the children begging for food. And here she was, eating chocolate in the Arizona desert, given to her by the enemy who had defeated her nation. The guilt was crushing, but the chocolate was still delicious. And that contradiction would haunt her for a long time to come. The days at Camp Florence settled into a predictable routine. Wake at 6, roll call at 6:30, breakfast at 7, work assignments from 8 to noon, lunch at 12:30, rest period during the hottest part of the afternoon, more work from 3 to 5, dinner at 6, free time until lights out at 10. It was structured, but it wasn't harsh. The American guards maintained discipline, but they didn't enforce it with cruelty. If someone was sick, they were sent to the infirmary and excused from work. If someone struggled with a task, they were given help or reassigned to something easier. The work itself was manageable. In the laundry, women washed clothes in large industrial machines that did most of the actual work. All they had to do was load them, add soap, and transfer the clean clothes to dryers. It was easier than hand-washing clothes in a river, which many of them had done during the war. In the kitchen, women helped prepare vegetables, set tables, and wash dishes. The cooks, mostly American soldiers assigned to food service, were patient and sometimes even friendly. One cook, a man from Texas named Bill, would hum country music while he worked. He tried to teach the Japanese women a few English words: potato, carrot, knife, spoon. Some of the women giggled at his pronunciation attempts when he tried to learn Japanese words in return. In the barracks, women cleaned floors, made beds, and kept the common areas tidy. It was housework, nothing more. Simple, dignified labor that had to be done anyway. What surprised the women most was the pay. It wasn't much, maybe $1 or $2 per week in camp scrip, but it was something. They could buy small luxuries at the camp store: toothbrushes, hand cream, writing paper and stamps to send letters, magazines in English that they couldn't read but enjoyed looking at the pictures, small bags of candy, Coca-Cola in glass bottles, cold from an actual refrigerator. Yumi became fascinated by Coca-Cola. She had never tasted anything like it. Sweet, fizzy, with a flavor she couldn't quite describe. She would buy 1 bottle each week and drink it slowly, savoring every sip. She wrote in her diary, "Today I drank Coca-Cola. It tastes like America, sweet, strange, impossible to fully understand." The free time in the evenings allowed the women to form friendships and communities. They would sit outside when the temperature dropped, talking quietly in Japanese, sharing stories of their lives before the war. Some taught each other skills: how to knit, how to sew, how to fold origami from scraps of paper. A few American soldiers would sometimes stop by during evening hours, curious about the Japanese women. At first, these encounters were tense and awkward, but gradually communication began to happen. A soldier might show them a photograph of his family back home. A woman might teach him how to count to 10 in Japanese. They would laugh at mispronunciations. Slowly, carefully, the wall of enemy began to crack, just a little. One evening, a soldier from California brought a baseball and glove to the camp. He started playing catch with another soldier near the women's barracks. Some of the younger Japanese women watched with fascination. Baseball was played in Japan too, though most of these women had never played themselves. The soldier noticed them watching. "You want to try?" He gestured with the ball. The women shook their heads shyly, but he insisted. He tossed the ball gently to Yumi, who caught it awkwardly. She threw it back, and it went wild, sailing over his head. Everyone laughed, not mockingly, but genuinely amused. For the next 20 minutes, they played catch, Japanese prisoners and American soldiers, tossing a baseball back and forth in the fading Arizona sunlight. It was a small moment, but it mattered. It was normal, human. Not enemy and prisoner, just people throwing a ball. These small normalities accumulated day by day. A guard would say good morning and actually mean it. A cook would give someone an extra scoop of food with a wink. A nurse would bring medicine to someone feeling sick and make sure they rested properly. It wasn't friendship exactly. There was still the barrier of captivity, of war, of language and culture, but it was something closer to respect. The Americans treated them like people, not monsters, not demons, just people. And that was more disorienting than any amount of cruelty would have been. Cruelty they could understand. They had been prepared for cruelty. This kindness, this ordinary human decency, they had no framework for it. Every act of normal treatment challenged the propaganda that had shaped their understanding of Americans. But every moment of comfort was shadowed by guilt. Letters from Japan began arriving 6 weeks after the women reached Camp Florence. They came in batches, heavily censored with black marks redacting anything military or political. But enough remained to paint a picture of devastation. Keiko received a letter from her younger sister. It had been written on the back of an old poster, the only paper available. The handwriting was shaky, written with what looked like charcoal instead of ink. "Dear sister," it read, "we are alive. Mother, father, and I survived the firebombing, though our house is gone. We live now in a shelter made from sheets of metal we found in the rubble. Father was injured and cannot work. We eat once a day if we are lucky, sometimes rice, sometimes just hot water with soy sauce. Many people have died from starvation and disease. Please, if you can, send anything. We are desperate." Keiko read the letter 3 times, then sat on her bunk and wept. Her family was starving, living in ruins, dying slowly. And here she was, eating 3 meals a day, sleeping in a real bed, buying chocolate at the camp store. She wasn't alone in this torment. Nearly every woman who received letters from home read similar stories. Cities destroyed, families displaced, food scarce to the point of famine, medical supplies non-existent, children dying of preventable diseases. One woman read aloud from her mother's letter, "Your brother's children are so thin I can see their ribs. They cry from hunger, and I have nothing to give them. We search through garbage for scraps. Last week we ate grass boiled in water. Tell me, daughter, what is happening to our country?" The women gathered in small groups at night, sharing their letters, their grief multiplying as they realized the scale of suffering back home. Japan had been crushed. Absolutely crushed. The atomic bombs, the firebombing, the complete destruction of the nation's infrastructure, it had all left Japan a broken, starving wasteland. And America? America was serving them meatloaf and mashed potatoes. America was paying them to do laundry. America was offering them Coca-Cola and Hershey bars. The contrast was unbearable. One woman said what others were thinking. They destroyed us completely, and now they feed us. What does that mean? Are they showing mercy, or are they showing us how thoroughly they defeated us? No one had an answer. Some felt the kindness was genuine. Others believed it was a calculated demonstration of power. Look how mighty we are. We can destroy you and still have plenty left over to feed you. Both interpretations were painful in different ways. Yumi wrote in her diary, "I cannot enjoy my food anymore. Each bite tastes like betrayal. My family starves while I grow fat on the enemy's generosity. How can I live with this? How can any of us?" The guilt manifested in different ways. Some women stopped eating much, forcing themselves to take only small portions, as if by starving. Themselves, they could somehow balance the scales. Others worked extra hours, as if by exhausting themselves they could earn the right to the food they were given. A few became depressed, spending their free time lying in their bunks, staring at the ceiling. The American staff noticed. A nurse approached Keiko one day after noticing she had barely touched her breakfast for 3 days straight. Through a translator, she asked, "Are you feeling ill? Are you having stomach problems?" Keiko shook her head, tears in her eyes. She couldn't explain. How could she make this American nurse understand? Her family was dying of hunger, and here she was, unable to eat because she had too much food. The nurse seemed to sense something of the conflict. She spoke softly to the translator, who then said to Keiko, The nurse says she understands this is difficult, but she wants you to know that not eating won't help your family. It will only hurt you. Your family would want you to survive. They would want you to be healthy so you can return to them when this is over. It was practical advice, and it was probably true, but it didn't make the guilt go away. It didn't resolve the fundamental contradiction they all lived with: comfort in captivity while their loved ones suffered in freedom. At night, the women would lie awake listening to the sounds of the desert, coyotes howling in the distance, the wind rattling the barracks walls, the footsteps of guards on patrol, and they would think about their families in Japan, sleeping in ruins, waking up to another day of hunger and desperation. The American Southwest was beautiful in its own harsh way. The sunsets turned the sky brilliant shades of orange and purple. The stars at night were crystal clear in the unpolluted air. The desert had a strange, austere dignity to it, but the women could not enjoy any of it. Every beautiful sunset was just another day their families suffered. Every comfortable night was another reminder of how one-sided this war's outcome had been. Despite the guilt, despite the complicated feelings, human connections continued to form. They were small, tentative, often awkward, but they were real. There was a guard everyone called Cowboy because he actually was one, or had been before the war. His name was Lieutenant Garrett, and he was from a ranch in New Mexico. He wore his uniform like he'd rather be in work clothes, and he walked with a slight bow-legged gait from years of riding horses. He spoke slowly with a drawl that fascinated the Japanese women, even when they couldn't understand his words. Cowboy was the one who talked about the Sunday barbecue. He was genuinely enthusiastic about it, describing in detail how the ribs would be cooked, though of course his audience understood almost nothing of what he said. He would gesture animatedly, showing how the meat would be rubbed with spices, how it would smoke for hours over mesquite wood, how the sauce would be brushed on at the end. The Japanese women watched him with bemused expressions, understanding his enthusiasm even if not his words. Food was a universal language, and his passion for cooking was clear. When Sunday arrived, the women were nervous. They had been told they were invited to this barbecue, but what did that really mean? Would they be served separately? Would they be watched while they ate? Would it be another form of subtle humiliation? Instead, what happened was entirely unexpected. The barbecue was set up in a central area of the camp. There were long tables covered with checkered cloths. There were American soldiers and Japanese prisoners mingling in the same space. Guards were present, but they weren't enforcing rigid separation. They were just making sure things stayed orderly. And at the center of it all were the grills. Large metal drums had been cut in half lengthwise and converted into smokers. Inside, racks of ribs cooked slowly over glowing mesquite coals. The smoke rose in lazy columns, carrying a smell that was absolutely intoxicating. Rich, savory, sweet, and smoky all at once. The women had never smelled anything like it. Japanese cooking didn't really include this kind of barbecue. The closest thing might be yakitori, but that was grilled chicken on small skewers, nothing like these massive racks of pork ribs dripping with sauce and fat. When it was time to eat, everyone lined up together, soldiers and prisoners, officers and enlisted men and Japanese women. The cooks, including Cowboy Garrett, served the ribs with obvious pride. They added sides: coleslaw, corn on the cob, baked beans, cornbread. Keiko accepted her plate with trembling hands. The ribs were huge, much more meat than she was used to eating. The sauce glistened dark red, smelling of tomatoes and spices she couldn't identify. She carried her plate to a table and sat with other Japanese women. They looked at the ribs uncertainly. "How did you eat this? With a fork? With your hands?" They watched the American soldiers, who simply picked up the ribs with their hands and bit into them, sauce smearing their faces. Keiko did the same. She lifted a rib, brought it to her mouth, and took a bite. The meat was so tender it nearly fell off the bone. The sauce was sweet and tangy and slightly spicy. The flavor was overwhelming, smoky, rich, unlike anything she had ever tasted. Her eyes widened. She took another bite, and another. Around her, the other women were having the same experience. Some laughed in surprise, others made sounds of appreciation. One woman said in Japanese, "This is too delicious. It isn't fair. How can prison food taste this good?" Cowboy Garrett walked by, saw them enjoying the ribs, and broke into a huge grin. "Good, huh?" he said in English, giving them a thumbs up. The women didn't know the words, but they understood the gesture. They nodded, smiled despite themselves, and one brave soul even returned the thumbs up, which made the lieutenant laugh with delight. For a few hours that Sunday afternoon, the barriers came down just a little more. People ate together. Some played horseshoes, an American game that the Japanese women learned by watching. Others sat in the shade and tried to communicate across the language barrier with gestures and drawings. It wasn't quite peace, it wasn't quite friendship, but it was more human than anyone had expected. The war was over, and slowly, painfully, people on both sides were remembering how to see each other as people rather than as enemies. But the complex feelings remained. As Yumi wrote in her diary that night, "Today I ate barbecue ribs with Americans. They were delicious. I am ashamed to say I enjoyed them. I am ashamed to say I am starting to like some of these people. What does that make me? A traitor? A survivor? I don't know anymore. As weeks turned into months, the internal conflict within each woman deepened. They had now spent enough time at Camp Florence to recognize that the treatment they were receiving wasn't an elaborate trick or a temporary kindness. This was simply how the Americans operated. This was their system, their values, their way of doing things. And that realization was profoundly disturbing. Because if the Americans had always been like this, organized, rule-following, relatively humane, then what did that say about everything the women had been taught? What did it say about the war? What did it say about Japan's choices? These were dangerous thoughts, disloyal thoughts, treasonous thoughts. Yet they crept in anyway, especially late at night when sleep wouldn't come and the mind wandered. Keiko found herself thinking about the nurses she had worked with in the Japanese military. They had been told that medical care for enemy wounded was a waste of resources. Let them die, officers had said. They are not human like us. Keiko had accepted this teaching without question at the time. It was war. Resources were scarce. Priorities had to be set. But here in Camp Florence, the American medical staff treated Japanese prisoners with the same care they gave their own soldiers. When one woman developed appendicitis, she was rushed to a real hospital in Florence and received surgery from skilled doctors. She received the same quality care an American patient would receive. The surgery saved her life. Why would the enemy do this? Why invest resources in saving the life of a prisoner? It made no strategic sense, unless the Americans actually believed that even enemy lives had value. Unless they actually followed their own stated principles about the dignity of all human beings. This was the crack in the wall. This was where the propaganda started to crumble. Because if Americans valued even enemy lives, then they were not the monsters Japan had described. And if they were not monsters, then maybe Japan had been wrong about other things too. Yumi struggled with different questions. She had been a translator, working with military communications. She had seen the reports, read the claims. Japan was winning. The Americans were demoralized. The enemy was on the verge of collapse. Victory was near. But all of that had been lies. Obvious lies now, in retrospect. America hadn't been on the verge of collapse. America had been so powerful, so resource-rich, that it could afford to build massive camps for prisoners and feed them 3 meals a day while simultaneously fighting wars across 2 oceans on the other side of the world. Japan, meanwhile, had been starving. Japan's cities had been reduced to ash. Japan's military had been shattered. And the leaders who had promised victory had either fled or were now waiting to be tried as war criminals. The realization made Yumi angry. Not at America, but at her own government. They had lied. They had sent millions to die for a war they couldn't win. They had sacrificed the nation for the pride of a few old men in Tokyo who refused to admit defeat. She wrote in her diary, "I am angry. I am so angry I can barely breathe. They lied to us. About everything. About the enemy. About our chances. About what victory would look like. They sent my friends to die on islands in the Pacific for nothing. For nothing. And now I sit here eating the enemy's food and they treat me better than my own government ever did. How do I make sense of this? How do I remain loyal to a nation that betrayed me?" These thoughts were shared, cautiously, in quiet conversations between the women. Not everyone felt this way. Some clung to the old beliefs, insisting that Japan had been righteous and honorable even in defeat. But more and more, especially among the younger women, doubts spread like cracks in a dam. The contrast was simply too great to ignore. Japan had demanded absolute sacrifice and given nothing in return. America had defeated them utterly and then given them soap, food, and medical care. One evening, during a conversation in the barracks, one woman said something that had been on everyone's mind. What if we were on the wrong side? What if Japan was the evil one and we just couldn't see it? The silence that followed was heavy. No one agreed out loud. That would be going too far, would be betraying their nation and their emperor. But no one disagreed either. The question hung in the air, unanswered but acknowledged. The American staff noticed the change in the women. They seemed less fearful, more relaxed, but also more thoughtful, more troubled. Some of the women started asking questions through translators, questions about American government, about democracy, about how decisions were made and who had power. One woman asked, "In America, can people criticize the government?" The translator conveyed the question to a guard who laughed and said, "Criticize? Lady, we do it all the time. It's practically our national sport." When this was translated back, the woman looked stunned. In Japan, criticism of the government or the emperor was unthinkable, often illegal, and always dangerous. Another woman asked about voting, about elections, about how leaders were chosen. The concepts were familiar in theory. Japan had elections too. But the reality as described by the Americans seemed different. People actually had power. Leaders actually had to listen to citizens or they'd be voted out. These conversations planted seeds. Seeds of different ideas about government, about society, about what was possible. Not all the seeds would take root. Many women would return to Japan and try to forget their time in America, try to reintegrate into their old lives and old beliefs. But for some, these ideas would grow and shape the rest of their lives. The ideological transformation wasn't happening in isolation. It was a collective experience that the women worked through together. In the evenings, after work and dinner, they would gather in small groups to talk. These conversations started cautiously, with coded language and careful implications. But gradually, as trust grew, they became more direct. "Do you think," one woman asked, "that we were told the truth about anything?" Another responded, "I think we were told what they wanted us to believe. Whether that's the same as truth, I don't know anymore." A third woman, older and more conservative, pushed back. "We cannot betray our nation just because we were defeated. Every country tells its people that they are right and the enemy is wrong. That is the nature of war. It doesn't mean Japan was evil." "But what about the things we saw?" someone else asked. "The orders we followed? I worked in a military hospital. We were told not to waste resources on prisoners, to let them die. Was that right? Was that honorable?" The older woman had no good answer for that. She frowned and looked away. Honor had been everything in Japan. The code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasized honor above all else. But was it honorable to let prisoners die? Was it honorable to lie to your own people about how the war was going? These questions had no easy answers, and the women wrestled with them night after night. Some defended Japan's actions by arguing that war changes everything, that normal moral rules don't apply when your nation's survival is at stake. Others argued that precisely because stakes are so high, moral rules matter even more. One woman pointed out something that bothered many of them. "We were taught that Americans had no culture, no refinement, no honor. But look at how they organize things. Look at how they follow their own rules, even when it would be easier not to. They promised to treat us according to the Geneva Convention, and they are doing it. That's a kind of honor, too, isn't it?" This observation hit hard. The Japanese military had often ignored international rules of war, arguing that such rules were Western impositions that didn't apply to Japan's unique situation. But maybe those rules existed for good reasons. Maybe following them wasn't weakness, but strength. The collective wrestling happened not just in words, but in actions and choices. Some women began trying to learn English more seriously. They practiced with each other, using simple words and phrases they had picked up from the guards and staff. Learning the enemy's language was a kind of surrender, an acknowledgement that maybe understanding the enemy was important, that maybe the enemy had something worth understanding. Other women started paying more attention to how Americans did things, how they formed lines without being forced, how they solved problems through discussion rather than just following orders from above, how they treated each other with casual respect rather than rigid hierarchy. These observations were filed away, mental notes about a different way of organizing society. There was also collective grief. Grief for their nation, for what it had become and what it had lost. Grief for the lives wasted in a war that had been unwinnable from the start. Grief for their own stolen years, their interrupted lives, their uncertain futures. One night the women gathered for an impromptu ceremony. They had no priest, no formal ritual, but they wanted to honor those they had lost. They lit candles, purchased from the camp store, and sat in a circle in one of the barracks. Each woman who wanted to spoke, remembering someone who had died in the war, a brother, a father, a husband, a friend, a patient who had died in a hospital bed, beyond saving. They cried together, they mourned together, and in that shared grief they found a kind of solidarity that transcended their ideological confusion. Whatever they thought about the war, whatever they thought about Japan or America, they all shared this pain. They had all lost something precious, and no amount of barbecue ribs or Coca-Cola could give it back. An American guard noticed the candlelight ceremony and came to investigate, probably to make sure nothing dangerous was happening. But when he saw what they were doing, women crying, speaking quietly, mourning, he backed away and left them alone. Later he told another guard, "Leave them be, they're just saying goodbye to their dead. God knows they've got enough dead to mourn." That small act of understanding, of giving them space to grieve, meant more than the guard probably realized. It was another crack in the wall, another moment of recognizing each other's humanity across the divide of war. By the time autumn arrived in Arizona, bringing cooler temperatures and relief from the brutal summer heat, the women had reached a deeper understanding of what had happened to them. It wasn't just that they had been captured and treated well. It wasn't just that their expectations about American cruelty had been wrong. It was something more fundamental. They had been given a window into a different way of life, a different value system, a different organization of society, and what they saw through that window challenged everything they had been taught about how the world worked. The key insight came from an unexpected source. The camp received a shipment of books donated by a church group in Phoenix. Most were in English, but a few were in Japanese. translations of American books about democracy, freedom, and individual rights. The books were distributed to the women who wanted them, with no censorship, no approval process. They were just given to them. Yumi received a copy of translated excerpts from the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. She read the words with growing amazement. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All men are created equal. The concept was radical to someone raised in Imperial Japan, where hierarchy was everything, where the emperor was divine and society was ordered in strict ranks. Equality, universal rights, these were dangerous, revolutionary ideas. But she had seen these ideas in practice, hadn't she? At the barbecue, officers and enlisted men had eaten side by side with prisoners. In the camp hospital, every patient received the same standard of care, regardless of rank or nationality. In the mess hall, everyone received the same portions of food. In the camp store, everyone's money, their camp scrip, had the same value. There was still hierarchy in the American military, of course. Officers gave orders and enlisted men followed them. But there was a difference in quality. The hierarchy seemed more functional than spiritual. It was about organization, not about fundamental human worth. An officer wasn't considered a better person than an enlisted man. He just had different responsibilities. This recognition that America practiced a kind of functional equality even within its military hierarchy was profound. It suggested that the lofty words in the Declaration of Independence weren't just propaganda. They were principles that actually shaped behavior, at least to some degree. Keiko had a different but related realization. She noticed that American medical staff, doctors, nurses, technicians, made decisions based on medical need, not on orders from above. When she had worked in Japanese military hospitals, everything was dictated by command. Doctors didn't decide who got treatment based on medical need. They followed orders about who was valuable enough to save. But here, medical decisions seemed to be made by medical professionals using medical criteria. It was so simple, so obvious, but also so different from what she was used to. It suggested that American society had ways of organizing expertise and decision-making that were more rational, more practical than the rigid command structure she had known. The deepest recognition of all, though, was emotional rather than intellectual. The women realized that they were changing. They could feel it happening, feel themselves becoming different people than they had been when they arrived. They were less fearful, more curious. They were less certain of old truths, more open to new ideas. They were less defined by their nationality, more aware of their individual humanity. This transformation was frightening because it felt like losing themselves. Who were they if not loyal Japanese subjects? Who were they if they questioned the values they had been raised with? Who were they if they felt gratitude toward the enemy who had destroyed their nation? But the transformation was also liberating. For perhaps the first time in their lives, they were thinking for themselves rather than simply accepting what they were told. They were making their own judgments, forming their own opinions, choosing their own values. One evening, Yumi wrote in her diary, "I think I understand now what has happened to us. We came here as prisoners of war, but we are leaving as something else. We are leaving as people who have seen a different way of living, a different way of thinking. We can never go back to being who we were. Whatever happens when we return to Japan, we are changed forever." The Americans didn't defeat us with bombs. They defeated us with an idea. The idea that maybe there is a better way to organize a society. That is the most dangerous weapon of all. That entry captured what many women felt but couldn't quite articulate. They were experiencing ideological defeat, not through force but through example, and they were beginning to accept it. The true climax came not in a single dramatic moment, but in a gradual accumulation of small realizations that built to an undeniable conclusion. It happened differently for each woman, at different times and in different ways. But for most, there was a moment when everything crystallized, when all the contradictions and confusion suddenly resolved into clarity. For Keiko, it happened on a Tuesday in October. She was working in the camp hospital, helping American nurses change bedding and prepare meals for patients. A young American soldier had been brought in from another camp. He had appendicitis and needed observation after surgery. Keiko brought him lunch, soup, crackers, juice. He was barely conscious, groggy from pain medication. He looked at her with unfocused eyes and mumbled, "Thank you, ma'am." Just automatic politeness, nothing more. But those two words, "thank you," struck her with unexpected force. An American soldier, even in pain, even half-conscious, had thanked her. A Japanese prisoner, an enemy. He had acknowledged her service with automatic courtesy because that's what he had been taught to do. To say thank you, to recognize the humanity of the person serving him. In that moment, Keiko saw with perfect clarity what had been happening these past months. The Americans weren't just following rules about prisoner treatment. They weren't just being strategically kind to demonstrate their power. They genuinely believed that all people, even enemy prisoners, deserved basic respect and courtesy. They believed it so deeply that even a drugged, injured soldier automatically said thank you to a Japanese woman bringing him food. It was built into their culture, their upbringing, their values. It was just how they were. And that was why Japan had lost. Not because America had bigger bombs or more ships. Because America had built a society where thank you was automatic, where the dignity of every person was assumed rather than granted from above. That kind of society could mobilize incredible resources, could motivate people more effectively than fear ever could sustain effort through years of war because people believed in what they were fighting for. Japan had demanded sacrifice and loyalty through force, through shame, through appeals to duty and honor that ultimately meant shut up and obey. America had achieved loyalty through something else, through actually treating people decently, through giving them a stake in society, through making them feel valued. Keiko stood there holding the empty tray, tears running down her face, understanding with painful clarity that everything her nation had taught her about strength and power had been wrong. Real strength wasn't in rigid hierarchy and demanded sacrifice. Real strength was in treating people well enough that they wanted to contribute. Real power wasn't in controlling people through fear. Real power was in organizing society so efficiently that you could afford to treat even your enemies with dignity. For Yumi, the climactic moment came during a film screening. The camp occasionally showed movies as entertainment, projected on a white sheet hung between two barracks. They were American films, of course, usually comedies or musicals, light entertainment to boost morale. On this particular night, they showed a film called It's a Wonderful Life. It had been released just the year before. Yumi didn't understand most of the dialogue, but she followed the story through context and emotion. A man who thought his life had been meaningless learned that he had touched countless lives in small, important ways. That every person mattered. That individual kindness and decency created ripples that spread through communities and shaped the world. The message was so simple it was almost childish. And yet, watching the film, Yumi realized this was the core of American ideology. Not grand philosophy or complex political theory, but simple belief that individual human beings mattered. That small acts of kindness counted. That regular people, not emperors, not generals, not leaders, were the foundation of society. Japan had taught the opposite. Individuals didn't matter. The group was everything. Your value came from your role, your rank, your service to the state. Personal happiness was selfish. Personal choices were irrelevant. You existed to serve something greater than yourself. But what if that was wrong? What if a society built on individual dignity and personal worth was actually stronger than a society built on collective obligation and enforced hierarchy? The evidence was all around her. America had won. Japan had lost. Thoroughly. Completely. Undeniably. As the film ended and the white sheet went dark, Yumi sat in the Arizona night and felt her old beliefs finally, completely crumble. She mourned them briefly. They had been the foundation of her identity for her entire life. But then she felt something else. Curiosity. Excitement even. If the old beliefs were wrong, then maybe she could build new ones. Maybe she could become someone different, someone who chose her own values instead of accepting what she was told. Later that night, she wrote in her diary, "Today I watched an American movie about one man's life mattering. Such a simple idea. We were taught that only the emperor's glory mattered, only the nation's honor mattered. But what if we were wrong? What if the most powerful idea isn't duty and sacrifice, but simply the belief that every person, every single person has value? Maybe that's why they won. Not better weapons, better ideas. And I think I believe it now. I believe them. Not that America is perfect, but that their core idea, human dignity, is right, and ours was wrong." The climactic revelation for most of the women was some version of this. The realization that they had been on the wrong side, not just militarily, but ideologically. That Japan's defeat was deeper than just losing battles. That the war had exposed fundamental flaws in how their society was organized, how their government functioned, how their values were ordered. This wasn't a comfortable realization. It was painful, disillusioning, frightening. But it was also true. And facing that truth was both the end of their old lives and the beginning of something new. As winter approached, though winter in Arizona was mild compared to Japan, news began to circulate that repatriation would begin soon. The women would be sent home. Back to Japan. Back to families and cities in a nation that no longer existed as it had been. The announcement should have brought joy. They were going home. They would see their families again. The captivity was ending. But instead, most women felt dread. Deep, heavy dread that sat in their stomachs like stones. They had changed too much. They had seen too much. They knew things now that most people in Japan didn't know. They knew what America was really like. They knew how thoroughly Japan had been defeated. They knew that the propaganda had been lies. They knew that a different way of living was possible. How could they go back and pretend otherwise? How could they fit back into a society built on values they no longer fully believed in? And there was another fear, more practical and immediate. What would they be returning to? The letters from home painted a bleak picture: cities in ruins, widespread hunger, disease, lawlessness in some areas. The American occupation was supposedly bringing order and aid. But how long would that take? What would life be like for a returned POW, especially a woman? In Japan's traditional culture, women were expected to be pure, obedient, submissive. A woman who had spent months living with American soldiers, even as a prisoner, might face suspicion and shame. Would they be seen as collaborators, as tainted, as disloyal? Some women worried about specific things. My fiancé died in the war. Who will marry me now at 27 with no prospects and a history of captivity? My father's business was destroyed. How will I support my aging parents? I have no home to return to. The address where I grew up is now a crater. Others worried about more abstract things. I don't think I can be the person they expect me to be anymore. I've changed too much. How can I bow and say yes, sir, to leaders who lied to us and destroyed our country? I don't think I can live in Japan the way it was, but I don't think Japan will become the way I want it to be either. Yumi captured the anxiety in her diary. In 1 week, we leave. I should be happy. I should be eager to go home. But I am terrified. What awaits me there? Who awaits me there? Who am I now? Not the girl who left Japan? Not quite an American. Something in between. Something without a clear place in either world. I am afraid of what comes next. The camp staff noticed the anxiety. Some tried to reassure the women. You'll be okay. Japan is recovering. Things will get better. But the women knew the staff didn't really understand what they would be returning to. Still, there was no choice. The war was over. Prisoners had to be repatriated. They had to go home, whether they were ready or not. The journey back across the Pacific was strange. The same route they had taken months before, but in reverse, and as different people. They traveled on a military transport ship, crowded into holds below deck, just as before. But this time they knew what to expect. This time they were returning rather than arriving. This time they were leaving certainty for uncertainty. When the ship pulled into Yokohama Harbor, the women crowded on deck to see their homeland for the first time in months. What they saw broke their hearts. The harbor was functional. American occupation forces had cleared the major debris and gotten basic operations running. But beyond the immediate port area, devastation stretched as far as they could see. Buildings were skeletal ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been burned to foundations. People moved through the streets like ghosts, thin and ragged. Children begged at the docks. The smell of smoke and decay hung in the air. This was Japan now. This was what they were returning to. This was home. They were processed quickly and efficiently by American occupation authorities. They received small care packages, some basic food, toiletries, a bit of money. Then they were released to find their own ways to their families, wherever those families might be. Keiko made her way to what had been her neighborhood in Tokyo. It took her 2 days of walking and riding on whatever transportation she could find. When she finally reached the right area, she couldn't find her house. Not because she had lost her way, but because the house no longer existed. The entire block was rubble. She asked neighbors, those few who had survived and remained, where her family was. Eventually she found them, living in a makeshift shelter made from scrap wood and metal sheets in what had once been a park. Her mother had aged 20 years in one. Her father was broken, hollow-eyed, barely able to recognize his daughter. Her younger sister was painfully thin, her ribs visible, her eyes too large in her gaunt face. They embraced, tears flowing, but there was also distance. Keiko looked healthy. She had gained weight at Camp Florence, and she was clean, her skin clear, her hair glossy. Her family looked like survivors of famine. The contrast was obscene. You were fed, her mother said quietly. Not an accusation exactly, but a statement of fact that carried weight. While we starved, you were fed. Keiko couldn't deny it. She had been fed. She had eaten barbecue ribs and mashed potatoes and fresh bread. She had drunk Coca-Cola and eaten chocolate. While her family ate grass and boiled water with soy sauce, she had been well fed in captivity. The guilt was overwhelming. She opened her care package and distributed everything to her family, the crackers, the canned meat, the dried fruit. They ate with desperate hunger, and she couldn't bring herself to eat with them. She had eaten too much already. Other women had similar experiences. Some found their families. Others found only neighbors who told them their families had died, from bombings, from starvation, from disease. Some found that their homes still stood but had been taken over by squatters who had nowhere else to go. Some found nothing at all, no trace of the lives they had left behind. The Japan they returned to was a broken nation, occupied by foreign forces, struggling just to survive each day. It was a nation that had bet everything on military glory and lost everything. A nation that would have to rebuild not just its cities, but its entire understanding of itself. The years passed. Japan rebuilt, slowly and then faster than anyone expected. The American occupation brought food, medicine, and eventually investment. A new constitution was written, guaranteeing rights that hadn't existed before. Women got the vote. Democracy was established, at least in form. The economy began to recover, then to boom. The women who had been prisoners at Camp Florence scattered to various lives. Some married and became housewives, keeping their experiences mostly to themselves. Others worked, taking advantage of new opportunities that hadn't existed before the war. A few became activists, pushing for women's rights and democratic reforms. Keiko became a nurse again, working in a hospital rebuilt with American aid. She never forgot the lessons she learned about treating all patients with equal care, regardless of who they were. She trained younger nurses with a philosophy she had learned in captivity. Every person deserves dignity and respect. Yumi became a translator, working initially with occupation forces and later with international businesses as Japan rebuilt its economy. She taught herself English using books and practice, building on the fragments she had learned at Camp Florence. She eventually traveled back to America, this time as a visitor, and visited Arizona. She stood in the desert and remembered, and felt a complex mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. Many women never spoke about their time in captivity. In post-war Japan, being a former POW carried shame. Better to say nothing, to forget, to move on. But they couldn't forget. The memories stayed with them. The taste of barbecue ribs, the smell of soap, the kindness of people they had expected to be cruel, and those memories shaped them, whether they spoke of them or not. They raised their children with slightly different values than their own parents had taught them. They questioned authority a bit more readily. They believed in individual rights a bit more firmly. They understood that the world was more complicated than simple stories of good and evil, us and them. They had learned through the strange grace of their captivity that even enemies can show mercy, that even in defeat there can be dignity, that even in the darkest circumstances human kindness can shine through, that sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't military might, but simple, genuine respect for human dignity. And so the barbecue ribs became more than just food. The Coca-Cola became more than just a drink. The soap became more than just a cleaning product. They became symbols of something larger, of a moment when women who expected death received life, when those who expected cruelty received kindness, when those who expected to be treated as enemies were treated as human beings. For those 847 Japanese women who spent months in the Arizona desert, the experience of captivity was transformative in ways their captors probably never intended. The American military simply followed its rules, treating prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. But those rules, that treatment, carried a message more powerful than any propaganda. That there was a different way to organize society, a different way to value human life, a different way to think about power and dignity. Cowboy Garrett, the lieutenant from New Mexico who promised them barbecue ribs that first week, never knew how much that simple gesture meant. He was just trying to be friendly, trying to ease the tension, trying to help frightened women feel a little less afraid. But to those women, that promise and its fulfillment represented something profound. It represented mercy when they expected cruelty. It represented abundance when they expected deprivation. It represented a world where even enemies could sit together and share a meal. As one of the women told her granddaughter 60 years later, "I learned more about democracy from barbecue ribs than from any textbook. Because democracy isn't really about voting or elections. It's about believing that every person, even your enemy, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. The Americans defeated us completely, and then they fed us. That's power. That's real power. Not the power to destroy, but the power to show mercy. And that lesson changed my life." The story of these women, like so many stories from World War II, reminds us that history isn't just about battles and generals. It's about ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, trying to make sense of a confusing world, trying to survive, trying to hold on to their humanity even when everything around them is inhuman. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more untold accounts from World War II. These stories matter because they teach us that even in humanity's darkest moments, kindness can break through. That even across the divide of war, people can recognize each other's humanity. And that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet. It's simply treating people with the dignity they deserve. Hit that subscribe button to hear more stories like this, and remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are and who we can choose to become.